My name is Peter Willington, and I'm one of the producers at Auroch Digital in the UK.
So Peter, let's talk. We talked about this a little bit before the interview, but your game is called Brewmaster, and it is a beer making sim. And there have been other games like that, but more of like a brewery simulator or something else. But your game is a little different because it's making beer on like a chemical level, correct?
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. So some studios before have tried to make, essentially games in which you are managing a brewery, and that's really not something that we're interested in doing. So Brewmaster is a home brewing simulation game, right? Basically the idea behind it is it's the most perfect representation of that hobby. So it's a hobby simulation game. So these have kind of become a bit more popular in the last few years. I'm sure you've played things like PC Building Simulator and House Flipper, for example. Relaxing, cozy simulation games of trying to simulate something that happens in real life, and that's what this one's about. It's about brewing beer in the home. And you were saying just before that you're a homebrewer as well, right? But not for beer.
Yeah, I make beer's too complicated because you have to boil it, you have to get the hops, and then you have to like put it in like a weird thing, and then it has to take 30 to 90 days, right? I do ciders and meads because they're simple. It's just yeast, your base, and the sugar and the honey, and then just let it ferment for 30. Like you can even drink that green and it's okay. It still tastes sweet. Just the longer it waits, the better it gets with like most alcohols.
Sure.
But beer's a lot more complicated. It's only not that I wouldn't want to, just it's a lot more complicated to do.
Well, okay, so that's actually basically one of the core reasons we wanted to make Brewmaster, right? So I'll be completely honest with you. Like before I joined, before we started the Brewmaster project up, I really didn't know all that much about beer, and like I couldn't have told you like many of the differences between the styles and that kind of thing. And I certainly hadn't tried homebrewing. And the reason is that, and I'm sure some of the homebrewing community would disagree with me on this, but the barrier to entry for homebrewing is actually quite high, I think. So you need quite a lot of initial money to kind of like get started, like maybe a bag kit's maybe 50, 60 quid. And that's a lot, that tends to get kind of really expensive if the first couple of ones that you do are kind of screwed up. There's also a lot of sort of chemistry behind the scenes that isn't immediately obvious as to what's going on in the barrel, right? And so one of the reasons we wanted to make Brewmaster is because we wanted to get people who like beer, even with just a kind of passing interest in like craft beer, or maybe they've heard, one or two things about making their own beers at home or homebrewing in some way, but never had that, the space in their home. So I live in the UK, like we do not, but my place is tiny. I haven't got the space for it, right?
Well, no, so you guys, especially in London, you guys are like this, like you.
Right, exactly. These, and we're either in tiny little boxes or in castles. That's the two different types of houses we have.
As has the history's been shown to see.
So there is quite a barrier to entry in that way. There's also a knowledge barrier to entry, right? So what is actually happening in the brewing process is actually quite a complicated, chemical process. And if you aren't completely familiar with that, there's definitely, YouTube tutorials out there, and they are great. But again, it's that thing of it's quite scary to kind of get into that kind of thing. And we basically wanted to do that. So we wanted to make a game for somebody like yourself who's got an interest in, food and drink and making fine things, but was always kind of a little bit like, oh, I'd like to try this, but this is a bit too much for me. And yeah, the whole game is built around lowering that barrier to entry. It's not about, it's not like a science exam, right? It's not like we're not like, well, this chemical and this blah 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 blah. That is all running in the background as you do your home brewing. Like, the absolute geniuses that I have a pleasure to work with, they are making that happen. It is simulating real life chemistry. But the actual interactions with that are much more straightforward, and we have a lot of kind of help and guidance on the way throughout the thing. So you actually learn how to do home brewing from the very, from not even knowing, having not had a beer, you can go from that to, making incredible sort of like super tasty ESBs and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's what's interesting about this is like your game sounds like it is a simulation game. Like it can actually make you become a better brewer. Like the things you learn in this game, you can apply to real life. It's not like a tycoon game, right?
It's certainly in that same way that the other sort of hobby simulation games are, right? Like, and even other simulators. Like if you jump into a European truck, you're probably not going to be able to drive it amazingly if you've driven Euro Truck Simulator. But the actual like core of the thing is absolutely it. So you could take a real recipe from real life, you could put that into the game and, you know, follow those steps, and you would get whatever was meant to come out of it at the end. You would get that with our simulation.
Dude, that's great, because like I'm here in the States, we have for some reason, a lot of craft breweries. They just love IPAs and hazy IPAs. I'm not a big fan of IPAs, but that's like you go to the supermarket or your local brewery, like that's all they have, and you're like, oh my god.
What do you prefer?
I like blonde ales. Like anything that I can see through is good for me. Like I like that. The IPAs are too heavy. Anything that's, I mean, Guinness, I have to be in the mood for. Just anything that's really thick or dark, I just don't. I'm not into.
So you want something a little bit lighter, a little bit close. I mean, so for example, you know, one of the great things about home brewing is, and again, this is something what we really want to reflect, is this idea of like creativity, right? So all of those IPAs that you're talking about that just absolutely blow your mouth out with bitterness and all that sort of stuff, those only came about because grass and pininess and all that stuff, right? Like all of that stuff only came about because of the amazing creativity in the brewing space, right? And we want to represent that authentically, but that also means that like if you want to take something and make something that is like much more malt forward, so a bit more of a classic kind of English IPA, I would say, you know, you can go ahead and do those things. You can also take styles that you're like, oh, I like bits and pieces of that, but I don't really like the fact that there's a ton of citra hops in here. So you can just go, well, what would happen if instead of citra hops, I went with, you know, something, a completely different kind of other hop. So you were like, oh, what about English Fuggles? I'll chuck that in. What does that actually do to the IPA instead? And that's the other thing, right? Like if you're home brewing, each time that you do that, you're kind of spending money on taking a risk on trying to make this thing. Whereas with the game, a huge amount of that creativity is, well, I screwed that up. Oh, well, never mind. I'll start again.
Yeah, because in real life, it takes, what, 90 days for you to taste it? How long does it take? I don't really even know, because I'm not a beer guy, so I don't know how long it takes to ferment.
I mean, so you can go, 40 days, 60 days, that kind of thing. That's not too much. I mean, there are a lot of beers that will go much, much longer if you do things like barrel aging. I had an amazing beer the other day that spent, I think it was like 12 years in a barrel, and it was like drinking raisins. It was amazing. It was amazing. Yeah, and so the game has we get this quite a lot. We actually have people asking, like, you know, do you have to wait in real time? Like, so, like, we are sort of
real time. That'd be great.
Right? Like, we were sort of, I want to get your opinion on this. Should we add that as like a hardcore mode, like where you actually have to wait real time? Because at the moment in our game, you literally can just forward time, and you can actually see the kind of sun passing in the clouds and all that sort of stuff, and you can speed forward over days and weeks and hours and all that sort of stuff. So,
I mean, like, it doesn't hurt to put a skip button. Like, I mean, like that. I mean,
exactly.
It doesn't involve. I mean, it might involve a lot of dead time. I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know how the code works, but like something like that, I don't think would be terrible idea. I don't know anyone who would want to wait that long. Maybe some hardcore enthusiasts. Maybe if you had like an option to pay a huge surplus to send your brewing to a company to do it, then send you that's like $1 million. There you go. That's like $1 million idea.
Yeah,
oh my god.
Yeah, that would. I mean, that is definitely something that would be really, really easy to implement. Yeah, we'll get right on it.
For $5,000, we'll make your brew and send it to you in 90 days.
It's like the ultimate in-app purchase, right? Like EA's got nothing on us. Yeah.
Microtransactions for the world. We send you beer. The thing that I noticed about your game, at least in the trailers that I saw and the gameplay that I saw, is that it's not that you simplify it, but you make it really approachable. Like when you open the book, like I've had books on brewing, and if I just open that book to a random page, it'd just be walls of text. And it's really overwhelming. Your book, even if I open up into the middle of the page, it provides all the information simplistically, explains to you the colors and, you know, the alcohol contents, and if, you know, is it region based on how people like it? Because I saw like a scale of like how people are enjoying your beer in your as well.
Yeah, so basically we'll have a way of rating the beers in the game. So obviously one of the things you can't do in a digital experience is, you know, you don't actually get to fly the Boeing, you don't actually get to drink the beer. But we do have the ability for the, so the game engine will actually recognize what flavors you've created, because there is a you know, chemical, you know, each thing you put in has a chemical output. Those outputs equal certain things on the palate and in the on the aroma as well. The bit that you're specifically referring to is you will actually get to work with these fictionalized breweries that we have in the game. We call them local breweries because we're kind of setting the game where you live. So we're not trying to pin it in, you know, Canada or the UK or the US or anywhere like specific. We're trying to say it's a local thing. We do have this light storyline. And just as in the craft beer world, there are people that when they get to the kind of semi-professional level, they will actually have like guest brews. They will guest brew as part of you know, a local craft brewery or that kind of thing. So that graph that you talk about was kind of tracking, oh, this is how well that beer's doing in the in all that sort of stuff. But there is no like financial component. So just because you mess up making a wit beer, that doesn't mean that you're going to have to like downsize your brewery, right? It's all about, you know, we want to keep that nice, cozy, relaxed thing. There is, you know, you can absolutely screw up a beer, but we don't want it to have that feeling of like, oh, like the pressure's on, otherwise I'm going to get a game over screen. And equally, you know, when you've unlocked ingredients and things like that, you just have them forever for free, right? So as long as you've unlocked them, you can always use them and always experiment, and that's part of that creativity basically. But to talk about the book thing specifically, you're absolutely right. And again, we also have contextual stuff. So let's say, for example, you know, tooltips in games, you just hover your mouse over something and something pops up and, hey, do this. Clippy, yeah, that's right. We've sub-licensed Clippy, and no, but basically, like, if you look at an item in the game, let's say, for example, you look at malt extract, which is a, you know, really straightforward, simple way, relatively simple, straight way of brewing. It'll be like, this is malt extract. It'll give you a tiny little line of information, and then a button you'll be able to press, and then you'll go through to that book, and it will say, malt extract. This is what this is. This is how you use it, etc., etc., etc. Because I don't know about you, but like as I get older in life, like I will sometimes leave games for like 2 weeks. I won't know how to jump or like fire or, you know, run or whatever it is, like specifically. So what we didn't want to do is have our, you know, beer chemistry game with, you know, information about like IBUs and SRM values, and like make sure that you do like, you know, 2 different forms of hopping. We don't want people to like leave the game for 2 weeks because they've gone on holiday, come back and then be like, what do I do with this sort of stuff? So again, all of this contextual information is about getting people the information that they need to make sure that they are able to make the beers in the game as efficiently aware as possible. And again, hopefully we'll hammer home that, that knowledge, basically, that real knowledge of how to actually homebrew.
You talked about having different ingredients and stuff, and I know because the beer world is absolutely insane with the things you can do. Like it's basically unlimited, even if it sounds like a terrible idea. But do you have ingredients like, can you infuse blueberries or strawberries or, you know, stuff like that? Like into, like, do you have like the oddball, like honey? Like, do you have the oddball ingredients in your game, or is it purely just like a beer simulator with like ingredients you would normally find in beer?
Yeah, so that's the beautiful thing. So at 1.0, when we launch next year, we'll have like a ton of different ingredients, the sort of classic ones that you talk about. But yeah, we'll definitely have those adjuncts as well. So we'll have like fruit purees and that kind of thing. Like, let's say, for example, you wanted to kind of lighten the body of a beer that you were talking about. So if I was going to make you a beer, I'd probably put a little bit of rice in there as well to lighten up that body of the beer a little bit. So that'll be in there too. Currently, we do not have like jam donuts, which is what some people are chucking into beers now to make pastry stouts.
Right.
But like one of the things we're doing is kind of an open development with our community, and we're running these kind of constantly running surveys and asking them like, what do you want to see in the game? And if everybody turns around to us tomorrow and says, I really want you to add cinnamon whirl pastries because I want to make some really sweet pastry stout at the end of it, like that definitely is a thing that we'll be like, okay, I mean, if people want to have that sort of stuff. And again, the idea is that, you know, when we launch at 1.0, we want to be able to kind of support it over time so we can continue to add these new ingredients. Because as you say, craft brewers are just absolutely nuts in the way that they will try and brew anything. They will chuck anything in. I mean, there's a bit of a mini fad at the moment with vegetable beers, right? So
Weird.
like, yeah, like kind of like they're kind of earthy and like I don't know, they're not for me, but there's a whole group of people that want them. And if suddenly all the vegetable beer fans like go, hey, we bought your game, we want you to chuck parsnips in, we're gonna be like, yeah, let's go for it.
Probably a specifically a US thing. Like people are literally chucking peanut butter donuts in their brewery and be like, it's a peanut butter stout. I'm like, what the fuck is this?
And brilliant, right? Like, why not? Just chuck it in.
Why not?
Like,
yeah.
That's the beautiful and brilliant thing about beer, right? It's so broad. Like, there's all these people who are like, quite rightly, who are like, you have got to keep to the German Reinheitsgebot. You have got to make it super pure beer. That's the only kind of thing that I would drink. Fine. And there is a whole bunch of other people who are just like, unless this is blasting my taste buds off at 100 IBUs and, you know, like absolutely making me sweat with the amount of like resin, you know, the sort of like dankness of the hops coming out of this thing, I do not care. And there's everything in between. And that's kind of the interesting thing about craft beer and trying to represent it in a video game, because you try and represent all of that authentically. You know, it comes, you naturally basically create fictionally a sort of like, you know, storyline campaign that you have to touch upon things like, you know, foodies, environmentalists, the people who really love about things about like the craft of it, the science of it. It's just so broad and deep that like, it's just a perfect, you know, thing to kind of get stuck into. And I can see why so many, you know, craft beer people really like find their ultra niche, like those vegetable beer fans I was talking about earlier. You know, they found their niche.
No, it's funny. You hit the nail on the head with like people who have never built a PC before. They go and they buy the PC gaming simulator and they see the process. And for me, because I do ciders and meads, like the thing that I don't understand how to do that, I'm sure if I read and researched, I could figure it out if I had the time, but it's how to get my alcohol content lower. Because all my meads and ciders are like 14%, which is incredibly high. So they're really strong, but they are good, but they're very strong. And I don't know what to do to make that alcohol content lower. I've tried doing things like, you know, fermenting it in a colder environment. So like, you know, it takes longer to do that, and they end up being too low at that point. And then so I'm not sure how to do that, but it sounds like your game is perfectly targeted for me because I could figure out how to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing, you know, as you point out, like if you chuck in like a load of malts, which essentially create the sugars which is basically forms the wort, which is the sugary liquid that the yeast eats. You know, if you chuck a load of malts into there, and this is why people chuck donuts into pastry stouts, the yeast will just gobble all of that stuff up, and that is how you end up with huge amounts of alcohol in beers, that kind of thing. So, you know, like lightening that out, yeah, absolutely. There's totally ways of doing that. Some people do create non-alcoholic beers in that way. They actually kind of like stop certain levels of fermentation. There's about 3 different ways of making non-alcoholic beers in the world, and that is kind of one of the ways of doing that. But yeah, as you say, like being able to experiment with that and go, why does this happen in this way? I think there's like a real beauty in, and again, I don't want to kind of like sell it as like this super nerdy, you know, like, oh, like you need to have all the get your equations out, lads. It's definitely not that, but there is something beautiful that Carl Sagan said about science, and that's that some of the beauty of science is in the discovery. And if you have this play set, if you have a science set, let's say, for example, and you go, I wonder what would happen if I did do this. There's a real like beauty in that discovery for yourself of how the world around you works. And again, part of that is you know, really inspiring to see when we're kind of like, you know, chucking the numbers into our chemical simulation, and then like, you know, our lead designer is making beers happen and changing beers based on, you know, like, oh, well, if we use this specific hop, it's gonna really specific you know, like chemicals that it has in it will impart these very specific flavors. It's amazing. Like, it's genuinely incredible to kind of toy around with that stuff.
My wife for my birthday bought me, I forget what the device is called, but it's how you measure the alcohol content, right? So you dip it in, you mark where it was before the fermentation, then you compare it and you times it by a numerical value, and that gives you a rough idea of the percentage of alcohol. And
a hydrometer.
You do that in your, like, that's going to be interesting to see how the game helps me with that, because the game has that in there. And like, I still struggle with how to do it. Like, I've watched videos on like the equation works and how to look at it, measure it with getting the foam off. And I'm like, how is this like, but your game, it would for sure someone would help someone like me figure that out a little bit easier, or just show me how to do the equation simpler.
Absolutely. But the other cool thing is, because we're a video game, we can also do, so we have this thing in the game called X-ray mode, which is what we're sort of calling it internally. And you can literally look at the beer, and you can see a real-time readout of what the yeast is doing, right? So you can absolutely take those readings and do all that sort of stuff, but you essentially have Superman vision in that you can look into what's happening. And so you can actually see the process going on right now. So right now in we have debug menus, because we're quite far out from launch. We have debug menus whereby you can start the brewing process, and you will literally see a graph, and it will represent the yeast, and they're kind of like down here, and they're just kind of sleeping at the moment. And then you bung a load of sugars in, like crystal malt, for example. And then suddenly you start to see the yeast go, oh, hello, and start to grow and eat. And you see the alcohol level go up. You see CO2 levels rise. Yeah, and it's fantastic. So you actually get more kind of stuff like that, because actually in real brewing, if you were to constantly open up and take hydrometer readings, you'd start really contaminating the entire batch with bacteria that kind of that kind of lives in the air. So again, you'll be able to do things that you kind of can't do in home brewing, which is kind of a fun thing to do.
So when does the game come out, and what platforms are you aiming for at launch?
We don't like to disappoint people, so we only ever work in years. So it's out in 2022, middle-ish, and it will be on PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Nintendo Switch, Windows PCs, and it will be on Xbox One and Xbox Series X and Series S family of, how are we calling these now? What do we call the
Series
X and the
S and X? Is it
S and X? Yeah, those ones as well. So everything basically. If you've got a system and it came out in the last 4 or 5 years, you can run it.